So Module 41 is a short module, and I'm sure nobody's going to complain, but it's going to be talking about the humanistic theories of personality. And I found these to be very helpful when I conceptualize a lot of things in terms of treatment, and I'll explain what I mean by that later. So the humanistic theories of personality largely deal with the theories of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And so we talked about earlier in the course behaviorism. So in the 1960s, people felt like behaviorism, a la kind of Watson and the dogs and Pavlov and all that stuff was dehumanizing, and the psychodynamic theorists kind of viewed everybody as being dysfunctional and the struggle between the superego and the id, and they thought there was a place for a third force in psychology, the humanistic perspective. So they wanted to study healthy people rather than with people with mental health problems. And this is kind of similar to the current movement of what's called positive psychology. So humanism focuses on the conditions that support healthy personal growth, because the majority of the population actually is quite healthy. And so to just look at psychopathology kind of takes away from what people are doing right and only focuses on what people do wrong. So Abraham Maslow was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he thought a lot about, fulfilling your self-potential and what he called self-actualizing. And according to Maslow, people were motivated to keep moving up a hierarchy of needs, going beyond getting their basic needs met. So this is what Maslow has as his hierarchy. And at the top of this hierarchy is kind of self-actualization, where somebody is fulfilling their entire kind of potential and they can kind of achieve self-transcendence. It's kind of what we all strive for, and I think few have achieved. If you look at the bottom, there are things like physiological needs, safety needs, and this is kind of what I use a lot in terms of my psychotherapy, because when you're working with populations such as offenders, such as individuals with severe and persistent mental illness, you can't get to the more, belonging, esteem, things like that, which we typically think of in psychotherapy, because they're not having their basic needs met. They're not having food. They're not having shelter. They feel unsafe. And so until you have those things met, you can't really go on and deal with those kind of higher level processes. So according to Maslow, somebody who is self-actualized includes somebody who is self-aware, self-accepting, open, ethical, spontaneous, loving, caring, focused on a grander mission than just social acceptance. So it's kind of, giving back to the community, giving of yourself, being benevolent, which is very difficult because most of us are still struggling with many things in our life. And it's only, I think this is something that we want to kind of think of from a lifelong or a life course perspective to achieve as we kind of go into our older age. Carl Rogers has the person-centered perspective, and he agreed that people have natural tendencies to grow and be healthy and move towards self-actualization, and he felt that there were three conditions that facilitated this growth. Genuineness, so being honest, direct, and not using a facade, so not being phony. Acceptance, so unconditional positive regard, which is something that is very strongly kind of associated with Rogers and humanistic therapy. Basically acknowledging feelings, problems without passing judgment or devaluing someone. So just kind of accepting them for who they are. And empathy, turning the feelings of others, tuning in to the feelings of others, showing your efforts to understand and listening well. Not sympathy, so we don't want to say, oh, I'm so sorry for you, oh, that's so horrible, but really just listening and being an active listener and understanding the experience the person is going through. So in humanistic psychology, there's always the struggle between the ideal self and the actual self. And this is kind of the crux of the self concept. So people are happiest when their self-concept, pardon me, apparently I can't speak today, matches their ideal self. So your image of yourself, if that really is, what you want yourself to be, therefore you are happiest. So it's important to ask people to describe themselves as they are and as they ideally would want to be. And then if there are any discrepancies, that's what you work on in therapy so that they can kind of achieve their ideal self. You can use questionnaires, but some people prefer open interviews. So questions about the actual self: how do you see yourself? What do you like? What do you value? What are you capable of? And so if those people's answers don't match the ideal self, they can't really accept themselves, and they're kind of unhappy, and so it's really kind of getting those two to match one another, to be congruent. So some of the critiques of the humanistic theory that people say that Rogers didn't appreciate the capacity for evil. He saw evil as a social phenomenon and not an individual trait. So what he said was, when I look at the world, I'm pessimistic, but when I look at people, I'm optimistic. And I have to agree with him because, I see, my students, I see my family, I see my friends, and I feel very optimistic about the future. But then when you turn on the news and you hear, Ebola here, terrorist attack there, gang violence, drugs, you become you become very pessimistic. But when you kind of look at each individual, then I think I feel optimistic as well. So human response is self-acceptance is not the end. It allows us to move on from defending our own needs to loving and caring for one another. So really, we want to move from being selfish to being selfless, and that's kind of how we were going to achieve our happiness. So is that too much self-centeredness? So some people say that pursuing the self-concept and accepting the ideal self and self-actualization is not really transcendence, but self-indulgent and self-centeredness. But I really think, in my personal opinion, that's not what they're trying to say, and that's a misunderstanding of the theories. The humanistic response is that a therapist using this approach should not encourage selfishness, but should keep in mind that a positive regard means acceptance and not praise. And it's only at this point that, people can give back if you kind of are able to